Hello, Sara Hammon. My name is Leah Greathead, and with me is Karen Horseman, and we're lawyers with the Ministry of Attorney General in British Columbia, and we're involved in a reference that's challenging the constitutional validity of our criminal code prohibition against polygamy. And as lawyers for the Attorney General, we're defending the constitutional validity of that criminal code provision. And I understand that you grew up in a polygamous, within a polygamous group, and that you've come to answer some of our questions on the video today.
Yes, I was born in Hillsdale, Utah, and raised in Colorado City. My dad, Jonathan Marion Hammon, had 19 wives, and my mother was the 10th, named Sara Weissman. And he had 75 children, 74 brothers and sisters.
And did you live with all 75 of your brothers and sisters?
No, we grew up in different generations. My oldest sister is old enough to be my grandmother. So, no, we grew up in different generations. There were about 30 kids growing up in the house when I was growing up.
And did you live all under one roof?
No, not all, the 30 of us, yes, but not all 75
right, yeah.
of us, yeah.
The 30 of you did.
Yes, we grew up in one house together. There were 18 bedrooms,
and
7 bathrooms.
And how was that?
It was very chaotic. It was organized to an extent because all of the women had their roles in the family, and they had, set out what our chores and our roles were in the family too. So they had it all organized as far as the family goes. There were just so many people. It was, it just one gets lost in all that. There were just so many of us.
What was your relationship with your father like?
I really didn't have a relationship with my dad. He didn't know my name or who my mother was, or even that I was his child, unless I was in the house with him. And that was for 13 years that I was with him.
And you were telling us earlier about a situation where you were asked to hug your father every day.
Yes, one of my dad's wives, she noticed that our first instinct when we saw our dad was to run away, to just go somewhere, a bedroom or wherever, and to hide away from him. So she had told us that every time we see our dad that we need to go up and give him a hug and tell him that we loved him. So one day we were out playing in the yard, some of my siblings and some of my dad's grandkids. We lived on a 10-acre property, so some of my dad's sons had houses on that property, and their kids would come over and play with us. And one day we were out playing, my dad came home from Salt Lake, and we, wanted to leave, go hide, but instead we lined up to give him a hug. And when he was asking all the kids what our names were and who our moms were, he realized some of the kids were grandkids. And he told the kids to go, he told the grandkids, you could just go home, assuming that we were all his grandkids, I guess. And I was toward the end of the line, but when all the grandkids started to go home and my siblings into the house, I went up to give him a hug. And he said, I told you to go home. And here I am, 20 feet from my front steps.
And he didn't know that.
He didn't know I was a child.
Mm-hmm. And what about supervision generally with that many kids around? Were there any areas or any concerns about?
Yeah, we were left to wander for most of the day during the summer, unless after the chores were done. We did have chores set up where we either had to be on a house crew, which was dishes and house cleaning, or an outdoor crew, which was gardening or yard work, things like that. But then, on our spare time, just off we go.
And so this community in Colorado City was a fundamentalist Mormon community,
mm-hmm.
sometimes called the FLDS.
Yes.
And that's the Fundamentalist Church of the Latter-day, or Church
the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That was sort of a term that came along later, but it's a group that followed the tenets of the early Mormon Church based on Joseph Smith's teachings. And we were taught that the Mormon Church went astray, and we were the ones carrying on Joseph Smith's work. So when the big tenet was polygamy, that was when the Mormon Church stopped living polygamy. That was, our job to carry that on. So.
And what in particular were you taught about polygamy?
That a man had to have 3 wives in order to go to heaven, and a woman's role was to, or a girl's role was to learn how to become a good wife by learning how to cook and clean and take care of the children.
And what kinds of things were done to teach you your role as a girl, to be a good wife, to cook and clean?
A lot of chores. I hate doing dishes still. It would take hours to do dishes because there were just so many people in our house. There were 11 mothers, about 30 kids. So, and we had dishwashers, but it just didn't make sense to use them because we couldn't even, put a dent in it with one load. So we would have somebody washing, somebody rinsing, somebody drying, and somebody putting away. And someone to clear the table and put the food away. So even with that big of a dish crew, it would still sometimes take over an hour to do dishes. It was crazy.
And what about marriage and having kids? Were you taught about marriage? And
oh yeah, that was a big part of what we were taught. Just that, that was what our religion was about primarily. Was getting married.
And what about being able to choose who you would marry? Was that part of the religion?
We were taught that we had to turn ourselves over. It was called turning ourselves over to the prophet.
And what did that involve?
Just when we were ready to get married, or when they were ready for us to be married, it was our responsibility to turn ourselves into the priesthood to be assigned to whomever they chose for us. Sometimes women back then, back in the 80s, would have a little bit more say, and depending on which group, whether it was Centennial Park or Colorado City, about who they would marry, but often it was just, this is who you belong to, and which was also accepted.
So I understand that there was a Priesthood Council then within the group that you grew up in?
Yes, back in the 80s there was a Priesthood Council. Leroy Johnson was the prophet, and my dad was next in line, then Warren Jeff's father, Rulon, and, 4 others.
And your dad was Marion Hammon?
Mm-hmm.
And so how were things run when there was a Priesthood Council? How were decisions made?
They had their priesthood meetings and made their decisions within that closed door meeting. I didn't have a lot of in on that one.
Right. And did the Priesthood Council continue to exist during your time there?
No. Around 1986 there was a split and it was almost a split right in half as far as the population. Half of the group went with the Johnson Jeffs group, and then half the group went with my dad, which they called the Jeffs and Johnson group was the first ward, and my dad's group was the second ward.
And in the second ward was your dad, and were there other members of the council that went with your dad?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think 2 or 3 went with my dad.
And they created then Centennial Park, is that correct?
Right, but it really became more of the Centennial Park group. They started buying the land and stuff. The Centennial Park itself, the community didn't start cropping up for about 3 more years.
And Leroy Johnson and the Jeffs, Rulon Jeffs and Warren Jeffs, were remained in Colorado City, and
I think at the time Rulon was living in Salt Lake and then moved down to Colorado City. But I think he was still kind of making a lot of the calls from Salt Lake, calling the shots from Salt Lake, and had some of his men down in Colorado City carrying out his dictations, I guess.
Right. And have you heard the one mighty and strong, that phrase? And what does that phrase mean?
Oh my gosh, I haven't thought of that for years. I always thought of it as meaning God, I guess. I don't know. I'm very familiar with the term, but it just, I never really put that much thought into what exactly it was. I thought it was God to me back then, or some avenging angel or something. It's a scary thing.
And after the split, what was your relationship like with people on the? So you were on with your dad's side, I'm assuming, and
the second ward.
Yeah, the second ward. So what was your relationship like with the people in the first ward?
Very strained after that. People who had been my friends my whole life suddenly were not even speaking to me, and it actually became kind of brutal a little bit, not physically, but, you know, name calling, prejudice suddenly became a big word in our vocabulary around that time, because it was just, there was a lot of meanness in it, that, you know, you're going to hell and I'm not, sort of thing, that belief among kids. We were just kids.
And were you permitted to speak with them?
Not permitted, no. Sometimes we broke the rules, but it was not something. It was something that we were told not to do, not to talk to each other.
Did you go to school together with them
Yeah,
after the split?
We did. I did. Later on, Centennial Park built a school, but when I was going to school, yeah, we had to go to school together.
So I asked about your relationship with your dad. What about your relationship with your birth mother and the other mothers that you grew up with?
I was very enmeshed with my mother. I think that's something that I think that's a strong tendency in polygamy, because when a woman is living in that kind of a relationship, she really has she becomes compared to all the other women in the family by her children, and so there's this tendency to either become enmeshed or to that bond becomes somehow damaged because of all of the competition, I guess, in the home. So a woman, you know, I know my mom went through this, you know, and then I was one of the kids that she went through it with, where I was comparing her to all these other women. So it wasn't just my dad comparing her to all these other wives, it was me comparing her to all the other mothers. You know, my mom she was a good cook, but she wasn't this, she wasn't that, you know, and that was like her one good quality was that she was a good cook, I remember, but she had so many nervous breakdowns when I was growing up that I had the sense my mom was the crazy one too, that was very traumatic for me, you know. And it's one thing if, you know, all those other people witnessing it are out in the neighborhood, and another when they're in your home. You know.
How did your other mothers treat you?
There were some that were abusive and some that were kind. There was some physical abuse, and then there were some that were kind and some that were indifferent. It varied based on the person.
Was there, did the moms treat their own birth children differently than the other children in the family?
Yeah, they did.
How?
And I know that when women had difficulty having or working out troubles with one of the other wives, they had a tendency to take it out on that wife's children. So yeah, and you know, the other thing in our family was that if a woman had a higher status in the family, like if she had a job, for instance, that her kids had more than the wife who didn't have a job. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, so I would notice that there were other kids in the family who had more than we did. They had, you know, nicer clothes, nicer things in their room, nicer toys, nicer stuff. And, you know, again, that's something where if you're the poor kid in town, that's one thing. When you're the poor kid in the house, that's a different thing.
And what about school then? Where did you go to school?
The Colorado City Elementary School, which was a state-funded school, but it was more religious than non-secular, I guess.
And you had religious teachings then?
Yes, we did. Well, you know, still school was not exactly church, but kind of an extension of it. We still had this, you know, thing that Leroy's the prophet, and there were pictures of him at the school. So, and I think that they edited some of the books that we or censored some of the books that we had, our health books, showing anything about the reproductive system. I remember the reproductive system specifically we skipped over that chapter.
Right. And how far did you get to in school?
Eighth grade.
Out there.
Yeah, I graduated from the 8th grade. I left home when I was 14, so I graduated from the 8th grade after.
And so was there daily religious classes?
Not at school.
No.
I've heard about the Alta Academy. In fact, I was baptized into the church up there, but it wasn't that. It wasn't like the Alpha Academy was.
And what about, as you were growing up and going to school, the relationship between boys and girls?
We were taught not to have a relationship with each other. And, you know, we weren't allowed to date or anything like that. We were taught to keep an arm's length distance from them. It wasn't as bad back then as I've seen it or heard of it becoming now, you know, where they were taught that boys are snakes, and, you know, I've heard that, but that wasn't to that extent. That we were not encouraged at all. In fact, strongly discouraged to have any kind of a relationship with them at all. Not just boyfriend, girlfriend, but male friend, female friend relationship. No.
And I had a question and then I've forgotten it about the school. What about a dress code? Did you have a dress code for school and other life?
Yeah, all of life. Yes, we had a very strong dress code. Girls had to wear dresses all the time below the knee and below. This was stretching it a little bit right there. Right. They wanted wrist, neck, and below the knee. It's become much more rigid, which I see, you know, what I think is a tendency for religious, or for polygamous, strongly religious polygamy to do, is to become more and more rigid as they progress to keep a stronger control over the people. But when I was growing up, they just had to be below the knee.
And who is deciding what the women and girls would wear?
I have heard that my dad is the one who started the dress code, or the more rigid dress code, back in the 50s or 60s.
And he would have been on the Priesthood Council
right.
at that time.
Right, but he's the one that started all that. And it just became more and more rigid for most of the polygamists. Some, you know, kind of stayed their own way, but.
Now, what about marriage? So you've talked a bit about that you were taught that girls were taught that their role was to get married and have children. Mm-hmm. And how did marriage work in your community?
That's a huge question. I need that one narrowed down a little.
Okay, well, let's start. Are you familiar with placement marriage?
Oh, yes. Yes. Placement marriage was something that was expected. It wasn't really a choice at all. It was just you turn yourself over to the priesthood to be placed into a marriage. And then what happened when you got married? Was it? I've heard mentioned that you were sealed. Is that sealed in marriage? Yes, you're sealed to your husband. That's something that takes place in the Mormon Church. That was taken from the Mormon Church when they get married in the temple there. That they're sealed to their spouse.
For time and time eternity.
I've never actually been to an FLDS wedding, so I don't know exactly what the what they say in the ceremony. But yeah, you're sealed, and you have to go through that to go to the celestial kingdom. And yeah.
Right. And did you have any experience with any of your sisters or any other girls you knew in your community getting married?
Yeah, a lot of my sisters were married, and many of them were underage marriages. My mom's first 3 girls were married. The oldest at 17, the second at 16, and then my third sister at 15.
And what about you? What happened with respect to you and marriage?
I asked to be placed into a marriage when I was 14 so that some creepy old man wouldn't come and ask for me. And that was in the spring of '89, and they set the wedding. The prophet who was arranging it set for the wedding to take place after my 15th birthday, but I ended up leaving later that summer, so it never happened.
Why did you leave?
For so many reasons. To get away from the abuse, and because I did not want to turn out like my mom. I saw all that she had gone through, and I didn't want that for me. I wanted so bad to have a normal family, a normal life, and I had a glimpse of it from the time that I spent in St. George and seeing the world out here, and that's what I wanted. I just wanted to be normal.
And so you said you wanted to get away from the abuse,
mm-hmm.
And what was the abuse?
There was a lot of abuse in our house: physical, emotional, sexual, mental, a lot of that. From my brothers, my father, a few of the mothers, physically abusive, emotionally abusive.
And you said you didn't want to become like your mom. What do you mean by that?
Well, I just saw her having so many mental and emotional problems, and to me that was related to the life that she was living, and I thought that would be my destiny if I stayed there.
And you said you asked to be placed in a marriage when you were 14 because you didn't want to be married to a creepy old man. What made you think you might be married to a creepy old man?
Because there was a creepy old man setting his eyes on me. And I won't say his name, but we would, I was friends with his daughter, and when I would go over there, I would just see the way he looked at me. And, so I thought that, and then he could have gone and asked to marry me, and I would have had to deal with that issue. At 14, I would have had to face that decision. Am I going to rebel, or am I going to do what I'm told? A 14-year-old shouldn't have to be faced with that. That's not a choice that a 14-year-old needs to have in front of her.
Did you have any other experiences with young girls being married to much older men?
Yeah, my half-sister was placed into marriage with her stepfather.
And what were their ages?
I heard that she was 16 when it happened, but it was so private and closed that they didn't really let many of the details out. So she's got 6 kids with him, I know that.
And what age group would he have been in?
He's older than her mother. And we grew up with him as Uncle Rudy. And when I say grew up with him, he lived in northern Utah, but when they would come down and visit, Uncle Rudy's here. Their kids were older than us. Cousins.
And And so did you want to get married when you were 14 and asked to be placed?
No, I wanted to get out. I wanted to have more control over my life and my decisions, and I thought that was the answer. Because I was 14, because, you're stupid at that age, and you don't, that's why I'm saying you shouldn't even have to face those kind of choices. The choices you should be faced with is, how am I going to do my hair today? And,
right.
Those jeans are cute. How am I going to get them?
Yeah.
How can I earn some extra money? Those are the choices that a kid should be facing.
And so you mentioned you wanted more control over your life. Can you talk a little bit about what you didn't have control over, or what women didn't have control over in the group that you grew up in?
Women had just so few. Their range of choices were so small because. I'm losing my train of thought. Sorry. Can we pause for a second? Or no?
Yeah, sure. But it ends up being on 2 discs. We can just wait for a minute. But
okay. No, it feels strange because I've already gone over this.
Yeah.
What did I say last time? Because that's what I want to get across again. But women, they have so few choices in their life because. I'm losing it. I'm sorry. I'm losing what I want to say.
Who makes the choices for them?
Well, that just depends because I'm sure it's different for every woman. In the based on the family, but they just have their range of choices is so small because they live in this closed society. And do you stay in and live this life that you hate or are unhappy in, or do you leave and go out to this foreign world where you have to start all over? And like I said, I was so fortunate to get out at the age that I did because I was still young and I could grow and change and become who I wanted to become. But for a woman who's past that youthful stage, it's so much more frightening to start your life over, especially if you have 8, 9, 10 kids. What do you do? And you're not getting alimony because you're not legally married to this person that you've left. And to go to court and fight for child support is just, out of the question because women are often timid from that group because they're broken down from such a young age that the thought of even going to court is terrifying. Standing up for yourself and your rights and what you've earned as a human being, what you've contributed to this family for 15 or 20 years is irrelevant once you're gone.
Right, and I guess the fact that many decisions are made for them, from what to wear, what to eat, what to...
Yeah, they're broken down from such a young age as far as individuality or choices or anything like that. It's just, and I have no proof of this, but I have heard that the sexual abuse in this society is necessary for breaking women down, to break their soul so that they don't feel like they have the right or the responsibility to take control of their life. That was something my grandmother passed on to her kids. And it came back to me, was that she had to be sexually assaulted in order to break her down. My grandmother was a very strong woman. And when she didn't agree, she said it.
And the teachings, I suppose, were that women were to be completely obedient to
completely obedient to their husband, and the husband obedient to the prophet. And actually, I would say the woman obedient to her husband and obedient to the prophet.
Right.
And the husband obedient just to the prophet.
And so where did you go after you left
I moved
at
here to
15?
St. George. And I would stay with my sister. And I was babysitting for a family she was friends with, and my dad sent her to me.
And how was it when you first left?
It was really scary. I felt I just felt in limbo, like I didn't belong here and I didn't belong there. And even there's still remnants of that today. I mean, I've been able to find a sense of happiness and more of who I am, but there's still that, I have a small circle of friends, but not a big social network, and I still feel a little bit caught in the middle, not really anywhere.
And did you suffer any, were there any problems transitioning?
Yes, a lot of problems. I became an alcoholic, and I've been sober 8 years now, but it was very difficult coming out, just trying to find myself. I mean, every person goes through that, I guess, but, for me it was just, where do I belong? I left my family, so once you leave a family there, it's not like moving from one town to another town and, hey, I'll see you on Thanksgiving. You sever those ties, and if they do let you come back, and I say if they let you come back, it's much different. The relationship, just from making the choice to leave home, the relationship becomes completely different. Strained. It's a cool welcome, not a warm one. Definitely not a warm one.
And Sara, I know that you I'm going to ask you about your reflections on polygamy, but before we go there was one other area that I wanted to cover off, which is the boys and the young men, and just the mathematical problem. If men are marrying in excess of 10 women like your father did, what happens to those boys that don't have someone to marry in that culture?
Anytime you have a closed society living with polygamy, you are going to go through these phases of lost boys and child brides. It's going to have to happen in order to maintain polygamy. You either go toward monogamy or you go through these phases. And I can't see how it goes any other way, because if one man has 3 wives, there's 2 men who have none, and that's just what's going to happen. And girls and boys at the age that they start developing normal, healthy relationships at 15, 16, 17 years old and start learning to relate to each other, the boys know they can't, it's hands off, because this girl might potentially belong to a 50-year-old man. And the girl's the same thing. Hands off, I can't be friends with him because I might get placed with somebody else, and that's just going to break my heart. They never, not only are they told not to do it, but they never can anyway, because it's impossible to develop those relationships because they know they're dead end.
And so what happens with the boys, the 2 that, that can't get wives.
They end up having. Well, you know, I have a theory that even before they become a lost boy as a group, lost boys as a group, that they have this sense already. There is not going to be a partner for me. There will be no partner for me. I think this guy has 5 wives. This guy has 7. This guy has 11.
And can they exist in your community without a partner? What normal man would want to? No, there's not an excess of single men in the community. No. And especially, I guess, when
they have to leave, and how devastating. I mean, that's another thing that so many people think that, the women are the victims. There's just victims everywhere. It's a big mesh of victims of this, because the men have been taught since they were little boys that in order to go to heaven, they have to have 3 wives. So here is a man that is damned for just because of bad math.
Right.
How heartbreaking. How heartbreaking for these guys. They've done nothing wrong except for believe this thing that their parents, the people that they trust most, have taught them. And they're going to hell because of bad math.
Yeah.
It's wrong.
And what about the child brides? Why do you say that there necessarily has to be child brides or waves of them?
Because in order to keep living polygamy, a man may be in his 40s and he's got 1 wife, but all of the other women in their 40s are married. And all the women in their 30s are probably married, and all the women in their 20s are probably married. But he's ready for another wife, so now he's got to go to 19, 18, 16. Or stay monogamous.
Yeah. And so I take it from what you said that you do think that there's harms associated with polygamy.
Absolutely. Here's what didn't we kind of cover that in a conversation though earlier with some of the other?
Yes, we have definitely. And part of this, I'm just wondering if there's any more harms that you think exist in polygamy that you haven't mentioned. You did talk about the lost boys, and you talked about
the
child brides,
the financial problem of a woman leaving, and I think that from my experience, there is more of a tendency for incest too, and because this has been an issue in mainstream society where when step families come together, there's more, and I can't say this for a fact, but I've heard that there tends to be a higher rise of step siblings sexually abusing full siblings. And I think that, and I know for sure in my situation, that half brothers were more abusive than my full brother was. And it just becomes, they sort of rationalize, I think, that it's a half sister, it's not a full sister. And my brother is married to 2 of my half sister's daughters. And that gene, I don't know, it's a mess. There's a lot of abuses that go on it, but but to tie it into what happens in mainstream society is it's difficult. But I think that again, just with the rationale that it's a half sibling, and I have actually never met a woman that did not encounter some form of sexual abuse out there. Never. Or whose child didn't. Or best friends. Every woman out there knows a woman, or many women with been abused.
Are there resources, or were there resources in your time for women like your mom who were suffering nervous breakdowns, or women who are or children who are being abused?
No, not for the abuse. No. When she was having her mental trouble, then yes, they would take her to the hospital if it got severe. If it didn't escalate to the point of where they were afraid she was going to harm herself or someone else, then they would just try and handle it at home. But if it ever escalates to that point, they would put her in the hospital or the guidance center in Blackstock, which is very popular among polygamists.
Oh.
Because a lot of polygamous women have had nervous breakdowns. I think that it's more of an issue in polygamous communities than it is in mainstream society. I've talked to some of my friends here there's mainstream and there's Colorado City in my brain. And they don't know anyone who's had a nervous breakdown. None of the women my age that I've talked to know women who have had nervous breakdowns. And yet I can count 14 or 15 off the top of my head out there that have had nervous breakdowns. And I think it again just comes back to that having so little personal power over your life and your destiny, and being so degraded in your own home, as a mother, as a wife, being one of, rather than the mother, the wife. You're one of. Make sure it's spendable in your home.
So I just have a couple of questions, and I'll let you go.
Okay.
How old was your dad when you were born?
He was 69.
And he's passed away now?
Yeah, he passed away in 1987. 88. 88.
And so when he died, you were...
I was 13 when he died, yeah.
And then you left the community at 14.
At 14.
How long ago was that?
21 years ago.
And just before the camera started rolling, one of the points you made that I wondered if you could speak to again was about the difficulty of maintaining close relationships or developing close relationships in a family as large as the kind of family that you grew up with.
Oh, yeah. It's just, when you have that many people, primary relationships around you all the time. In an average nuclear family, there is the mother, the father, and, maybe 2 or 3 siblings. And that's, a good-sized family. And then, if you've got step-siblings and stuff, that's sort of, on the fringe. But you've got your nuclear family. When you've got 30 people, 30 siblings, and then 11 mothers in one home, it's enough to make your brain explode. You cannot develop close, bonded relationships with that many people. I have so few real memories of my full siblings because there were just so many distractions, so many other people, so much other stuff going on around me that I never really formed those bonds. And today I have trouble developing close relationships with people because it's like I have my bubble. If anyone threatens to pop it, I just roll away.
And did that also impact how you felt in terms of your value as a child in that
Absolutely, family? Yeah. I felt very lost in the family, like a number more than a valuable member of it.
Those were all my questions, and thank you, Sara, for putting up with our technical
No
difficulties.
problem.
Yeah.
Just the first time we did, it rolled off my tongue, and then the second time it was kind of jumbled up. Like, did we talk about this?
Yes, and for the record here, we had to redo the tape here because it didn't record the first time, so that's unfortunate. You did, I think, say one story, Sara, in the first recording that wasn't in the second, and I think it was related to the issue of both feeling like a number and the supervision issue, and that was the story of the grain elevators.
We had a granary in our yard. It was down by the barn where we kept hay and grain and feed and stuff for our cows and horses. And one day, my sister and I were playing down there after lunch, and actually what I didn't mention in the first one prior to that was that we had a post in our yard that separated the house from the barn, and the girls were not allowed to go past the post because that's where the boys went down to the farm to do their chores. And that was one way they segregated. That was one way they tried to handle the sexual abuse issue in our family, was by putting up a post. And my sister and I went down there to play because that's where the animals were, and we loved the animals, and we had such a wide. The boys had full range of the yard, the girls had half, which sort of spells out, the whole dynamics of polygamy, my memories of polygamy. But my brother sexually assaulted my sister that afternoon in the granary, and when I tried to get out to go get my mother, he had beaten to the door, and he locked us in there for hours. And it was dinner time before anybody even knew that we were missing. My mom, finally came looking for us, and I could hear her calling. She couldn't hear me calling back, but it was hours before she even knew that we were missing.
And how old were you then?
I think I was 9, my sister was
Well, thanks again, Sarah, and sorry for the technical difficulties.
Okay. I feel bad because, yeah, the first time it just, it was.
But it was great the second time, too.